Hey everybody, so Dr. Kuniak with a supplemental weekly video lecture. One of the things that I wanted to make sure that I talked about with everyone is as you're considering assessments, whether you're considering using one for research or whether you're considering using one for assessment with a client in clinical practice, something that needs to be considered is how the question is being asked or how questions are being asked. Um, I know that in my own experience designing assessment tools, not that I've done a whole lot of that, but even in the limited capacity that I've done some of that work, but especially when I was a practicing, well, I am a practicing counselor, but when I was practicing counselor, clinical director in an agency, I was often tasked, either independently or on a team, to come up with some new assessment tool. The state was requiring us to assess for something, or we just realized that we had a deficit in some of the tools that we already had, and so I think it's often surprising to new counselors to recognize that that might be your responsibility to come up with a tool. A lot of times it doesn't have to be, you know, have great internal and external validity or reliability statistics or anything like that. It just needs to get the job done. And so, one of the things that I really want you all to consider is how we ask questions. Um, it may sound extremely simple, but you have to ask for what you want. And then you have to assess what they're giving you and ask yourself, okay, am I communicating incorrectly? What do I need to do to prompt the client or research participant to, to get me where the information that I want to look for? So a couple examples of this are, in my own research experience in my dissertation, I had asked a question, and so, spoiler alert, I guess. My doctoral research was on gaming, and so I apologize. It's the example that I have. I'd asked a question about so as part of the demographic sheet that participants were filling out, they had to answer their age, their identified gender, and then I asked a question: Do you identify as a gamer? Yes or no? And my presumption was that that would just be kind of a pre-test screening sort of thing. So just like the age thing, I wasn't taking clients or I wasn't taking participants who were under the age of 18 for the research. Now I had some people come through and fill out the survey and they were 16 or 17 years old, and so those samples I had to remove them. And so I figured that that gamer question was going to be the same thing. That my presumption was that the only participant pool that I was going to be drawing in were people who identified as being a gamer. However, what I discovered was people didn't read that question the same way that I was posing it. It's a very simple question: Are you a gamer? Yes, no. That was it. You just check a box, right? I had a lot of people indicate no. And then they answered questions where they were gaming, you know, um, you know, several hours a day, multiple days a week. Question about what systems, consoles, types of games they played. They named off half a dozen to a dozen different systems that they regularly used. So by my definition, they would be a gamer. They're gaming a lot. They spend a lot of time and money and energy on gaming. However, they answered the question no. And so I realized as I was scoring these packets, at first I thought I was going to have to throw those packets out because they answered my screening question no, and I was only drawing from a population of gamers. But my dissertation chair had said no, you don't have to throw those out. That's not like an age 18 thing where you're worried about the ethics of taking on, that you had proposed a study that was for adults and you're taking on participants that are under the age of 18. This is not a legal requirement thing. This is sort of interesting data. They're reading it differently than you proposed it. This is something that needs to be quantified. Like, you need to record all of this, and then it needs to be discussed in the discussion and conclusion section of your dissertation. Because what I realized was, or what I presume was, I can't know because I didn't ask the question the right way, was some of these folks might be answering the question not do they identify to themselves that they are a gamer, but rather do they externally let other people know that they're a gamer. And so the question, do you identify as a gamer, they were reading to others. And that's not how I posed it, but that's how they read it, I think. So I had to make some suppositions about that, and of course report it as a limitation to the study because I don't know. I didn't ask it that way. But it was a really great lesson for me to realize that even something as simple as that, I might not be asking the question correctly. So some of that you're not going to know until you put the questions out there and get information back from your participants or your clients. This is why sometimes people do multiple research studies on the same or similar topics, because they ask the questions one way and they get data back, and then they realize, just like I did, I think I asked the questions wrong. Or I need to ask them differently because I just realized that there's some extraneous variables, at play here. Similarly, I can recall in a clinical assessment, a biopsychosocial actually, which we'll be covering a little later in this semester. I the agency. I'm sorry, I just had a random string of thoughts with this, but the agency that I had worked for had a really long form biopsychosocial, and something that I kind of broached the topic of already is the idea that these can be long or short. They're usually a little bit of a longer assessment, but even at that, you can look at the difference between like a 6 or 7 page psychosocial and a 13 or 14 page psychosocial, and so my and incidentally, the terms biopsychosocial and psychosocial is just kind of shortening it. It still covers biological information typically. It's just kind of like verbal shorthand. But anyway, the psychosocial assessment, for years that I worked at the agency, we counselors were recording one of the questions as denial problems. The question asked for the client to check off whether or not they had a string of different health related concerns, and one of the concerns listed, so it said things like, do you have vision problems, yes or no, and then a sub question that said, nearsighted, farsighted, etc. Anxiety, and then it had, so yes or no, and then some sub questions related to that. And so one of the questions was denial problems, yes, no. And so and it had no qualifiers after that. So we read those questions off to our clients, and they would answer them, and we would score them, and we would move on. And I'm talking years, multiple clients, multiple counselors. We recorded denial problems and wrote that up then in the intake assessment. Client acknowledges denial problems, client does not acknowledge denial problems as part of the biopsychosocial. It wasn't until I was redesigning, I was tasked with it as program director, redesigning the biopsychosocial, and I realized that this question about denial problems was clustered with some other health related, like physical health related questions, and not the psychological health questions. And it just struck me one day. I had no clue one way or another, but it struck me. It's not denial problems. It was a typo. Dental problems was what was being asked. So you really do, and no one caught that. And I am not trying to suggest that I had some sort of profound, insight into, the usage of this tool. It was dumb luck. It clicked in my head one day after using it so many times. But that data was gathered incorrectly for 100+ clients. I have no idea how many clients came through that agency, even before that psychosocial was there, long before I had started working there. But yeah, dental problems, not denial problems. And that's a pretty blatant example because it's a typo and an error, but I think it still stands, to sort of speak to the point. We have to ask questions in a way that is going to get us the information that we're looking for, whether that's the framing of a question is off one way or another, or whether we're asking the wrong question entirely, like denial versus dental problems. If we're asking whether or not a person is in recovery from substance use, there are multiple pathways to recovery, and whether or not we agree with that philosophically, we have to ask it of our clients. What are they using, whether it be practiced coping strategies or alternative less harmful substances, what are they using to try to manage their recovery non-judgmentally, and just gather the data and assess it. So I want to pose these thoughts to you to consider as we continue to, go through the literature and consider different assessment tools and things like that. There's a lot that goes into asking the right questions, and we do not get it right the first time all the time. So don't first off, don't beat yourself up if you're not asking the right questions the right way. It's important to kind of go back and make corrections, but also realize that there was an intention in mind when these questions were designed, and it doesn't always come off that way when we go to use it. And this speaks to all sorts of things, cultural differences, educational differences, just differences in lifestyle, and where we were brought up and how we were raised, and the things that we were exposed to may frame our mind differently than the person who was writing the assessment, and so may give us different results as a result. So I hope this was helpful to consider. Look forward to seeing you all in class and continuing this conversation. Certainly reach out with any questions, comments, concerns as we go forward. Thanks, and have a good day.